What remains of a civilization after its name is no longer spoken? Not the emblems of power, not the certainty of borders, not even the stories people once told around firelight. Sometimes what survives is quieter than that. A wall beneath the sea, a road swallowed by sand, a stone too large for the age that claims to have raised it. History likes clean lines, but the earth rarely cooperates. We are taught to imagine the human past as a steady ascent, one century handing its tools to the next, one culture replacing another in a pattern that seems almost orderly. Yet scattered across deserts, coastlines, jungles, and mountain plateaus are places that do not fit that comforting rhythm. They feel less like relics and more like interruptions. They ask whether memory is as fragile as stone is durable. They suggest that forgetting may be one of civilization's oldest skills. This is not a story about secret masters or hidden empires waiting to be restored. It is something more intimate than that. It is a story about absence, about the unsettling space between what was built and what was remembered, about human beings leaving traces so immense, so deliberate, that their silence becomes part of the mystery. Again and again, we find the same pattern. A place is discovered. The first images astonish. Measurements are taken, fragments cataloged, possibilities opened. Then the language changes. Certainty becomes caution. Wonder becomes classification. The unknown is filed away, not always out of malice, but often because uncertainty makes us uneasy. And still the ruins remain, patient as weather. Across the chapters ahead, we will follow those remains into the deep water of memory. We will visit lost cities, buried sanctuaries, foundations older than their legends, and civilizations that seem to flicker at the edge of accepted history. Not to prove the impossible, but to listen carefully to what the missing pieces reveal. Because sometimes the deepest truth is not what vanished. It is how easily the living learn to look away. What if the oldest city we can still touch is also one of the hardest to fully understand? At first light, the stones of Jericho do not announce themselves with grandeur. They sit in the pale earth of the Jordan Valley, worn by heat, dust, and the quiet labor of time. Yet beneath that silence lies one of humanity's earliest experiments in staying put, in drawing a circle around life and calling it home. Long before empires carved their victories into monuments, people here were already building walls. That detail still carries a strange emotional force. A wall means more than defense. It means planning, cooperation, fear, hope. It means a community imagining a future long enough to protect it. In Jericho, archaeologists uncovered traces of settlement reaching back thousands of years before the familiar milestones of recorded history. Homes rose from mud brick, grains were stored, the dead were honored. Life repeated itself until repetition became culture. And then there is the tower. Massive, ancient, almost startling in its ambition, it rises from a period so early that it can feel out of place in our mental picture of prehistory. Why build something so large, so soon? Was it practical, ceremonial, protective, symbolic? The honest answer is that we do not know with complete certainty, but perhaps that uncertainty is part of the lesson. Even at the dawn of settled life, human beings were already more complex than simple survival can explain. Jericho reminds us that civilization did not begin with spectacle. It began with ordinary decisions made over and over: to plant, to return, to bury, to build, to remain together despite drought, conflict, and the pull of the unknown. Over centuries, those decisions accumulated into something that could outlast memory itself. Yet permanence is never guaranteed. The city changed hands, changed shape, was broken and rebuilt. Layers formed over layers until the place became less a single story than a conversation between centuries. And maybe that is what the first cities really were. Not final answers, but ongoing negotiations between people and landscape, between need and imagination. Standing before ruins like these, we are tempted to ask who they were. But another question waits beneath it. When did human beings first begin to feel the ache of continuity, the desire not simply to live, but to leave behind a world that could remember them? It started, as many mysteries do, with a landscape that looked almost empty. The high plains of southeastern Turkey can seem severe at first glance. Windswept, stony, and indifferent to human ambition. But under that austere horizon stands Göbekli Tepe, a place that has altered the way we imagine the beginning of organized society. Its pillars rise like thoughts from a forgotten mind, carved with animals, abstract signs, and a confidence that feels almost impossible for its age. For generations, many believed that agriculture came first, and monuments came later. The story seemed logical. People settled down, produced surplus food, formed hierarchies, then built temples. Göbekli Tepe complicates that sequence. Here was a ceremonial site created by communities that may not yet have lived in fully settled agricultural towns. In other words, the impulse to gather, to symbolize, to ritualize existence may have preceded the systems we usually associate with civilization. That reversal matters. It suggests that meaning was not a luxury added after survival had been secured. Meaning may have been one of the engines that made complex life possible in the first place. People may have come together not only because they needed food, but because they needed shared stories, shared gestures, shared spaces where the visible world touched something larger. The stones at Göbekli Tepe do not speak plainly, yet their arrangement implies intention so deep it still unsettles the modern mind. And then there is the most haunting detail of all. Much of the site appears to have been deliberately buried, not simply abandoned to erosion, but covered by human hands. Was this an act of closure, reverence, protection, transformation? We are left with interpretations, each revealing as much about us as about those who came before. We want a final explanation, but ancient people were no less layered than we are. Their actions could have held many meanings at once. Göbekli Tepe asked us to reconsider what a civilization truly begins with. Not walls, perhaps, not kings, not writing. Maybe it begins with a circle of people looking at the world and deciding that it contains mysteries worth honoring together. If that is true, then the first architecture of humanity was not merely shelter, it was attention. And perhaps the oldest monuments were built not to conquer time, but to stand briefly inside it with awe. What survives when a civilization leaves behind no clear voice, only a city arranged with astonishing discipline? In the baked earth of the Indus Valley, Mohenjo-daro emerges not as a monument to kings, but as a testament to order. Its streets were laid out in grids. Its bricks were measured with consistency. Its drains were engineered with a brush that still feels modern. Looking at it now, one does not first sense spectacle. One senses thought. There is something profoundly moving about that. Many ancient cities impress us with palaces, tombs, or temples meant to elevate rulers above ordinary life. Mohenjo-daro offers a different image of human aspiration. Here, the genius seems woven into daily existence. Water moved through planned channels. Houses opened onto organized streets. Public and private space were shaped with an understanding that civic life depends not only on power, but on systems, habits, and mutual trust. It was a civilization that appears to have taken the ordinary seriously. And yet, for all its sophistication, its people remain strangely distant. Their script has not been conclusively read. Their political structures are still debated. Their beliefs, while hinted at through seals and figurines, remain partly veiled. We can trace the outlines of their intelligence, but not the cadence of their speech. It is like finding a beautifully composed letter in a language no one alive can decipher. The form is intimate. The meaning hovers just beyond reach. Then comes the question that shadows every vanished city. What happened? Environmental shifts, changing rivers, economic strain, gradual dispersal. Scholars continue to weigh possibilities. What seems increasingly likely is not a single dramatic ending, but a long unwinding. A civilization may disappear not in one catastrophic night, but in a century of adjustments, migrations, and quiet losses that no one living inside them could fully name. That possibility feels uncomfortably familiar. We often imagine collapse as obvious while it is happening, marked by flames or conquest. But history suggests something subtler. Sometimes a world fades through accumulated pressure, through changes so incremental they are mistaken for inconvenience until they become irreversible. Mohenjo-daro leaves us with a difficult, tender thought. Human achievement is not measured only by what dazzles. Sometimes it lives in drainage channels, measured bricks, and the ethics of shared space. And when such a world falls silent, the deepest mystery may not be why it ended, But how much wisdom can vanish even when the streets themselves remain? What if a city could be hidden in plain sight for centuries, not because it was invisible, but because no one was looking for the right shape? In the Peruvian desert, where the wind moves over stone and sand with almost no witness, Caral rises from the landscape so quietly that it once seemed like part of the land itself. Then the geometry became undeniable. Platforms, sunken circular plazas, monumental architecture emerging from a civilization older than many of the better-known centers of the ancient world. Caral unsettles familiar assumptions. When many people think about the birth of complex civilization, they picture warfare, dynasties, and fortified ambition. But Caral offers another possibility. Here was a society capable of planning at scale, organizing labor, shaping ceremonial space, and sustaining long-distance exchange, all without the obvious visual dominance of war culture in the remains. There are no grand murals celebrating conquest, no clear narrative of kings trampling their enemies. What appears instead is a different kind of power: coordination, ritual, music, agriculture, and the patient management of resources in a difficult environment. That does not mean Caral was simple or utopian. No ancient society is. Human communities are always composed of tension as well as cooperation. But the city suggests that complexity can emerge through forces other than violence alone. Cotton grown inland may have supported fishing economies on the coast. Trade linked distant ecologies. Public spaces may have bound people together through ceremony and shared identity. In that sense, the city was not merely built from stone. It was built from relationships. There is a quiet beauty in that idea. Civilizations are often remembered through their loudest remains: arsenals, walls, declarations of dominance. Yet some of the most enduring worlds may have been held together by less visible threads: exchange, belief, seasonal rhythm, and trust extended across distance. Caral seems to stand in that quieter register, where social complexity feels less like a shouted command and more like an arrangement of many lives moving in concert. And still, it too receded. The plazas emptied, the structures weathered, sand resumed its slow authority. What endured was not the daily sound of the place, but its outline, a memory without a voice. Caral asks us to consider whether our definitions of greatness are too narrow. If a civilization flourished through balance rather than spectacle, through interdependence more than domination, would we know how to recognize its legacy? Or would we pass over it, mistaking silence for simplicity? How does a civilization vanish when its roads are still visible from the sky? In the dry coastal plains of Peru, the ancient world of the Nazca does not rise upward in towers or walls. It stretches outward across the earth itself. From the ground, much of it can seem modest, even elusive. But from above, the landscape changes into something uncanny: vast lines, geometric paths, and animal figures drawn with such scale and precision that they appear less like decoration than intention made visible. The Nazca Lines have inspired countless interpretations because they occupy that uneasy space between clarity and mystery. We can see them, we can measure them, we can map their forms in great detail, and yet their deepest purpose remains partly unresolved. Were they ceremonial pathways, astronomical markers, offerings to deities, expressions of ecological devotion in a landscape shaped by precious water? Most likely they were woven into a worldview in which land, sky, ritual, and survival could not be separated. That is often the difficulty with ancient meaning. We inherit the outline, but not always the philosophy that made it coherent. Beyond the famous lines, the Nazca were engineers of adaptation. In one of the driest places on Earth, they developed ingenious systems to access underground water, building spiral openings and aqueduct-like channels that still testify to practical intelligence under severe conditions. Their ceramics and textiles reveal visual sophistication, but it is their relationship with the environment that leaves the deepest impression. They were not merely enduring a harsh land. They were reading it, negotiating with it, shaping a life within its limits. And perhaps that is why their disappearance feels so poignant. Environmental strain, social change, shifting conditions. These are not dramatic endings in the cinematic sense. They are slower pressures, the kind that accumulate year after year until a way of living can no longer hold its form. The people do not become unreal because their system falters. If anything, they become more recognizable. Their story begins to resemble one of humanity's oldest patterns. Brilliance meeting fragility in the space between innovation and uncertainty. The Nazca left behind a civilization written partly in stone and partly in absence. Their greatest monuments are not built to be entered. They are meant to be seen from a distance, almost as if the land itself had become a page. And that raises a haunting question. When human beings make meaning at such scale, who are they addressing? Each other, the heavens, the future, or simply the hope that someone someday will notice they were here? What happens when a city is so complete in stone that it feels less discovered than remembered? In the dense green heights of the Andes, Machu Picchu appears the way certain thoughts arrive in later life, suddenly, clearly, and with the strange feeling that they had been waiting all along. Mist drifts across terraces. Granite walls catch the morning light. The mountain seems to hold the city rather than merely support it, as if architecture and landscape had entered into a rare agreement. For many, Machu Picchu has become a symbol of mystery itself. But mystery can be misleading if it turns living people into abstractions. The Inca were not ghosts moving through a dreamscape. They were planners, farmers, builders, astronomers, rulers, laborers, and families. Their achievement here was not only aesthetic, though it is undeniably beautiful. It was practical, intellectual, and spiritual all at once. Stones were cut to fit without mortar. Water was channeled with precision. Agricultural terraces shaped the mountain into sustenance. The city was built with an understanding that power, ritual, and ecology belonged to the same world. And yet one central question remains open in the public imagination. Why was it left behind? Scholars continue to debate the specific sequence of events, but what matters most may be the larger truth beneath the debate. Even a place so harmonious, so carefully tuned to its environment, existed within the vulnerability of history. Disease, imperial upheaval, political fracture, shifting priorities. Civilizations are rarely undone by one cause alone. They are often overtaken by converging forces that no single generation fully controls. There is something deeply human in that. We like to believe that beauty protects what deserves to last. But history offers no such guarantee. A city can be brilliantly made and still fall silent. A culture can understand mountains, stars, stone, and season, and still be interrupted by events beyond its design. Machu Picchu endures not because it escaped time, but because time could not fully erase the conversation it held with the earth. Its terraces still step down the slopes like measured breaths. Its walls still suggest a civilization that sought not dominance over nature, but alignment with it. Perhaps that is why the place continues to move people so deeply. It reminds us that the highest achievements of humanity may not be the ones that shout across history, but the ones that briefly learn how to belong. To land, to labor, to one another, before the clouds close in again. What if an entire world could be swallowed not by war, but by water, forest, and forgetting? In the low, humid light of Central America, the Maya still feel astonishingly present. Their temples rise above the canopy like stone thoughts refusing to disappear. Their calendars, inscriptions, and cities testify to a civilization of extraordinary intellectual depth. And yet the story most people inherit is often simplified into a single dramatic question. Why did they collapse? The truth, as so often happens in history, is both more complex and more human than that. The Maya did not vanish in the absolute sense. Their descendants are still here, carrying language, memory, and continuity through centuries of rupture. What changed was the political and ceremonial landscape of the great classic cities. Places once alive with rulers, scribes, astronomers, and ritual eventually fell quiet. Stelae stopped being raised. Palaces were reclaimed by vines. Population patterns shifted. The silence came unevenly across regions and generations. That unevenness matters. It reminds us that civilizations rarely end like a door slamming shut. More often they fray. Drought may tighten its grip. Conflict may intensify. Trade routes may weaken. Authority may lose its sacred force. A city that once seemed permanent becomes one fragile node in a network of pressures. To the people living through it, the change may have felt less like apocalypse than exhaustion, One failed season, then another. One fractured alliance after the next. And still, what the Maya achieved remains breathtaking. They charted celestial cycles with remarkable sophistication. They developed writing, architecture, mathematics, and ceremonial systems of great complexity. They transformed rainforest landscapes into lived worlds of agriculture, ritual, and governance. Their cities were not accidents of stone. They were acts of imagination sustained over centuries. Perhaps that is why their ruins feel so emotionally charged. They do not simply mark an ending. They reveal a tension at the center of all human ambition. Our desire to build systems vast enough to outlast us, and the reality that every system depends on rain, trust, memory, and time. In the Maya story, loss and continuity exist together. The great cities may have dimmed, but the people were never reducible to their monuments. And maybe that is the deeper lesson. A civilization is not only what it builds, it is also what survives when the buildings fall silent. What does it mean when the sea becomes an archive? Off the coast of Yonaguni, at the edge of Japan's southern waters, stone forms descend into blue depth, with a geometry that has unsettled divers, geologists, and dreamers alike. Terraces, sharp angles, broad platforms, seen through the wavering light beneath the surface, they seem to invite one of humanity's oldest instincts, to look at an unfamiliar shape and ask whether nature alone could have made it. Yonaguni occupies a delicate border between evidence and interpretation. Some researchers argue the formations are primarily natural, shaped by the fracturing tendencies of local sandstone and the long sculpting force of currents and seismic movement. Others see signs that at least part of the site may have been altered by human hands. The disagreement itself is revealing. It reminds us that mystery does not always arise from what is hidden. Sometimes it emerges from what is visible but undecided, from a landscape that resists the comfort of a final answer. There is something particularly haunting about possible ruins beneath water. The sea changes the emotional register of history. On land, a fallen wall still belongs to the world we inhabit. Underwater, even the most rigid geometry feels dreamlike. Silence thickens. Distance distorts scale. The mind begins to imagine coastlines where there are none. Communities now submerged, ceremonies once held, where fish now pass through shafts of light. Whether Yonaguni is a lost monument, a natural wonder, or some combination of both, it draws power from that threshold between memory and erasure. And perhaps that is why the site resonates so widely. It touches a fear older than writing, that entire chapters of human life may lie beyond reach, not because they were insignificant, but because the planet itself keeps revising the map. Shorelines move, waters rise, earthquakes shift the ground beneath certainty. The past is not stored in a perfectly ordered room. It is scattered across deserts, caves, forests, and seabeds, vulnerable to every force that makes the world alive. Yonaguni does not give us permission to believe anything we wish. It asks something harder. It asks us to stay with uncertainty without rushing to turn wonder into doctrine. That discipline may be one of the most human forms of respect. Because in the end, whether those underwater stones were carved by intention or by time, they still confront us with the same sobering thought. How much of our story may depend on landscapes that no longer exist in the shape we remember? What if a city could disappear not beneath the sea, but beneath the logic of survival itself? In the great emptiness of the Arabian desert, where dunes move like weather made visible, the legend of Ubar has endured for centuries as a rumor of wealth at the edge of ruin. Caravans once crossed these distances with incense, resins, cloth, and memory. Somewhere along those routes, people said, there stood a city of pillars, a place so prosperous it seemed almost immune to the desert that surrounded it. That image has always carried two meanings at once. On one level, Ubar belongs to trade, geography, and the practical brilliance of desert life. No city survives in arid land without understanding water, movement, and the fragile mathematics of exchange. Wells must be maintained. Routes must be trusted. Alliances must hold. The desert does not tolerate wasteful civilizations for long. If a place like Ubar flourished, it did so because human beings learned how to turn scarcity into connection. And yet the story of Ubar also feels larger than logistics. A city built on long-distance trade becomes, almost by definition, a meeting place of worlds. Languages overlap, beliefs mingle. Strangers arrive carrying news from coastlines and mountains unseen by local eyes. Wealth accumulates, but so does vulnerability. A hub is strong only as long as the network around it remains alive. The very openness that makes it flourish also leaves it exposed to shifting climates, collapsing routes, exhausted water, and the sudden indifference of history. That may be why the city endures so powerfully in the imagination. Ubar is not only a lost place, it is a symbol of a certain kind of human confidence. The belief that movement can overcome distance, that exchange can tame harshness, that prosperity can be made to hold in an environment where almost nothing stays. And then one day the balance fails. A well runs dry. A route changes. Sand returns to its ancient work. There is something hauntingly modern in that pattern. We often speak of resilience as if it were permanent, but many systems are resilient only until one quiet threshold is crossed. After that, what seemed enduring begins to dissolve with surprising speed. The desert has a way of stripping stories down to essentials. Ubar, whether reconstructed through archaeology, memory, or legend, asks us to consider how civilizations are lost. Not always through conquest, sometimes through overreach, sometimes through dependence on a delicate equilibrium mistaken for permanence. And perhaps that is the oldest warning buried in the sand, that abundance is never the opposite of fragility. Often it is simply fragility in its most beautiful form. What if the most enduring mysteries are not hidden in remote jungles or beneath deep water, but standing in plain sight where generations have already looked? On the Mediterranean island of Malta, the temples of Gantia and the other megalithic sites do not conceal themselves. They rise from the earth in massive curves in weathered limestone, older than many of the civilizations more commonly placed at the center of world history. Their scale is arresting, but what lingers even more is their age. They force the mind to widen its map of what early people were capable of imagining and making. There is something almost intimate about these structures despite their size. Doorways, chambers, apses, thresholds. The architecture suggests movement, gathering, and ritual rather than pure display. Whoever built these temples was not merely stacking stone. They were shaping experience. Light would have entered at certain angles. Bodies would have passed from open space into enclosure. Sound would have changed inside the chambers. The buildings seemed designed not only to stand, but to guide attention, perhaps toward the sacred, perhaps toward community, perhaps toward cycles of life and death that bound both together. And yet the people who raised them remain partly beyond us. We know they quarried, transported, and positioned immense stones without the metal technologies later societies would rely on. We know the work required organization, belief, and continuity across time. But we do not fully know what stories were told there, what fears were carried into those chambers, what hopes were laid down in stone. Their civilization did not leave us a clear script. What remains is architecture as testimony, not a sentence, but a presence. Then comes the silence. The temple-building culture faded. New peoples arrived. The meanings once attached to those spaces loosened and disappeared. The stones remained, but their original world did not. That separation between structure and memory may be one of the saddest features of prehistory. We inherit the effort, but not always the intention. Still, the temples of Malta offer a gentle correction to modern arrogance. They remind us that sophistication is not owned by the recent past. Deep time was not empty of complexity, devotion, or design. Human beings were already wrestling with mortality, season, and transcendence long before the narratives we usually call history had begun to write themselves. Perhaps that is why such places feel less like answers than invitations. They ask us whether wisdom always needs words, or whether, sometimes, the oldest truths are carried forward by stone, weather, and the quiet persistence of wonder itself. What if the most revealing ruins are the ones that seem too remote, too fragile, too improbable to have carried the weight of a civilization? Across the Pacific, on Rapa Nui, Easter Island, the great stone faces stand with an expression that has become almost universal in the human imagination. The moai are often presented as symbols of enigma, but they are more than that. They are evidence of a society that transformed isolation into identity, carving memory into volcanic stone and setting it against the sky. To understand Rapa Nui is to move beyond the simplified myths that once framed its story as a cautionary tale of failure alone. The people who settled this island crossed enormous stretches of ocean with courage and navigational knowledge that still inspires awe. They arrived in one of the most isolated inhabited places on Earth and built a culture of ritual, kinship, labor, and artistic power. The Moai were not random feats of ambition. They were part of a social and spiritual world in which ancestors, presence, and landscape were deeply connected. And yet isolation can magnify every strain. Resources are finite. Ecosystems are vulnerable. Social tensions can sharpen when options narrow. Over time, changes in environment, internal conflict, and later the devastating impact of outside contact all reshaped life on the island. What was once a dynamic ceremonial landscape became, in the modern imagination, a puzzle stripped of its human nuance. But no civilization should be reduced to its final hardship. To do so is to confuse its wounds with its essence. There is a special sadness in how often Rapa Nui has been misunderstood. The Moai appear silent, but silence is not emptiness. Behind those carved faces lies a story of navigation, adaptation, devotion, and endurance under extraordinary conditions. Even the toppling of statues, often treated as the emblem of collapse, can also be read as part of a shifting social world rather than a single moral lesson. Rapa Nui asks us to think carefully about how we narrate decline. Do we use the past to flatter our certainty or to deepen our compassion? The people who raised those figures were not symbols. They were human beings making meaning at the far edge of the world, trying, as all civilizations do, to bind memory to place. And perhaps that is why the Moai remain so moving. They face inland, toward the communities they once watched over, as if reminding us that the heart of any civilization is not its mystery. It is the human longing to be remembered by those who come after. What if the final mystery is not how ancient civilizations vanished, but why their disappearance continues to trouble us so deeply? By now, the pattern has become unmistakable. Across deserts, valleys, islands, mountains, forests, and seabeds, human beings built worlds of astonishing care. They aligned stone with sky. They shaped water into order. They turned ritual into architecture and memory into landscape. And again, those worlds thinned, shifted, or fell silent, leaving behind enough to stir wonder, but rarely enough to quiet it. It is tempting to search these stories for one universal lesson. Pride comes before collapse. Climate determines fate. Violence ruins what beauty cannot defend. But history resists such neat conclusions. Each civilization we have encountered carried its own texture of circumstance, its own ecology, imagination, tensions, and thresholds. Some were overtaken by drought. Some unraveled through political strain. Some may have dispersed gradually, not with a final catastrophe, but with a long and almost invisible surrender to changing conditions. The past does not repeat itself in exact forms. It rhymes through vulnerability, and yet something unites them. All of these lost worlds reveal how much civilization depends on things that are easy to underestimate while they are still intact. Rainfall, trust, shared meaning, continuity between generations, the ability to adapt without forgetting who one is. Monumental ruins can trick us into thinking the ancients were obsessed only with permanence, but perhaps they understood impermanence better than we do. Perhaps that is why so many of their greatest works were tied to season, ceremony, ancestry, and celestial cycles. They were not trying to escape time. They were trying to live within it with dignity. There is also another reason these vanished civilizations continue to matter. They challenge the arrogance of the present. We often imagine ourselves as the culmination of history, equipped with better data, stronger tools, and more stable systems. But the ruins suggest a humbler truth. Intelligence does not eliminate fragility. Sophistication does not guarantee continuity. A society can be brilliant and still be breakable. So the question that lingers is not merely what happened to them. It is what we see of ourselves in their remains. When we study lost civilizations, we are not only looking backward. We are measuring the distance between what humans can create and what humans can keep. And in that distance, perhaps, lies the beginning of wisdom. In the end, what do these vanished civilizations leave us with? Not certainty, not a single grand theory that gathers every ruin into one clean explanation. What they leave is subtler and perhaps more valuable, a way of looking at human history that is less triumphant and more compassionate. Beneath every fallen wall and weathered stairway is a simple truth. People were here. They loved places enough to shape them. They believed in futures they would never fully see. That may be the deepest thread connecting Jericho, Göbekli Tepe, Mohenjo-daro, Caral, the Nazca, Machu Picchu, the Maya, Yonaguni, Ubar, Malta, and Rapa Nui. Each site reminds us that civilization is not a static achievement. It is a living arrangement between memory and environment, between imagination and limit. It asks for cooperation, adaptation, and shared belief. And because it is living, it can weaken, it can fracture, it can be forgotten, even after it has changed the world. Yet forgetting is never complete. A stone platform remains, a buried wall emerges after rain. A line in the desert survives because the climate is kind, or because chance has, for a while, decided to spare it. Archaeology is often described as a science of discovery, but it is also a practice of listening, of learning how to hear what silence can still carry. The past does not return whole. It returns in fragments, and fragments ask something of us: patience, humility, the willingness to let mystery remain part of knowledge. There is comfort in that, strangely enough. We do not need every question resolved for these places to matter. In some cases, their unfinishedness is precisely what makes them feel alive. They remind us that human beings have always lived at the edge of what they could understand: building, naming, worshiping, measuring, doubting, beginning again. The unknown is not a flaw in history. It is one of its most honest elements. So perhaps the final lesson is not about disappearance at all. Perhaps it is about continuity of a different kind. Across thousands of years, across lost languages and altered coastlines, one impulse remains unchanged: the desire to leave meaning behind, to mark the earth, to gather others into a shared story, to say in stone or ceremony or careful design that this moment mattered. And maybe that is why these ancient worlds continue to call to us. They are not asking to be turned into legends of certainty. They are asking to be remembered as human, fragile, intelligent, hopeful, unfinished, much like us, much like whatever future will one day try to understand the traces we leave behind.